This video is being taken on a segment of the Vernal Brush Creek Ranch now paved road. There are two stories that I want to tell you that deal with this particular spot. Well, first off, I have to say that the occasion of these two stories does not include a paved road like we now have. It was very much dirt, very much clay. There's a lot of rock through here. When the rains came, you always waited 24 hours before you tried to go anywhere, because otherwise it just didn't work. And apropos of that, one time my dad rode his saddle horse from the ranch to my grandparents' place, which is about 8 miles away in Naples, and the horse's long tail got so clogged up with mud that my dad had to get off and cut off the long tail so that he could make the trip. So mud and things of that sort were very problematical. All right, here are the two stories. My dad was basically, as I'm reflecting now, was basically living a semi-subsistence farm life. The cash money that they had derived from my mother's working as a part-time stenographic secretary for the land bank, the so-called USDA land bank in Vernal. And my dad's income derived from an annual sale of his lamb crop, because this was basically a sheep ranch. But he also grew wheat. And the occasion of this story was one time when he was carrying a load of wheat to the flour mill in Vernal and bringing back supplies for the ranch. The flour mill would take wheat at 100 pounds, say, and give you 50 pounds of flour. So it was a 2-for-1 trade. Now, my dad had started out with horses, teams, 2 wonderful Clydesdale horses, magnificent animals. I loved them to the very core of my being. Then he graduated for draft purposes, he graduated to an old McCormick tractor that had been refurbished with a Chevrolet engine and an old McCormick tractor rear end and iron tires, iron wheels. Then he was able to buy a International Farmall tractor, a new one, by the way. It was a Model H, and was the best looking piece of equipment on the entire Brush Creek landscape. So with that Model H new International tractor, he was then carrying his wheat to the mill in Vernal, up over this road, down into this swale. On the way back, it was really, really cold. This was in the winter. And I remember getting off from the wagon. There was nothing enclosed. This was just open air winter experience. And because my feet were freezing, and so I would hold on to the back of the wagon as he pulled up this incline in probably second gear of his Farmall International H tractor. By the way, it had 5 gears in it, 5 speeds, which was marvelous for those days. And so I ran up this hill to warm up my feet. I remember that story quite a long time, because when I was doing research for the book that I wrote on my Henry forebears, this story came out and I found it in the Vernal Express. My grandfather Henry was also plying this road in the winter with his teams, and it was so cold that he was off walking next to one of his horses to capture heat from the horse, break the wind from hitting him directly, and as he was partway up this hill, the horse stumbled and sidestepped and stepped on his ankle and dislocated his ankle. And in the middle of the winter, all alone and on a dislocated ankle, he was able to get back up on his wagon and get his horses turned around and head back to the farm in Naples. and get some kind of help to get the ankle put back together. And somehow, I don't know how people got through these kinds of accidents, but this hill then, because of its incline and because of these two episodes, became part of a formative experience of my life. We've come up the Brush Creek area several miles from, I guess only maybe about a mile since our last stop. And we're at the Postma residence on the western upreaches of the Brush Creek Valley. And we're stopping here because on this property is an old coal mine. And the coal mine is known as the Collier Mine. My great-grandfather, my grandfather Henry, and my uncle Lloyd Henry worked in this mine. And I have a picture of part of the operations of this mine in my book, A Search for Place. Now, why this mine? The coal was of a poor quality. It was not a very large vein, but it was coal, and the alternative was wood, and or transshipping from the better quality coal in Carbon County over Indian Canyon or up through 9 Mile Canyon. The freight costs, of course, were fairly high. So this was a precious little mine for the valley, and it provided coal for people in Vernal, for people on Brush Creek, and even as far away as Jensen. The mine is now, I understand, the postmaster have told me that the mine is now covered over and closed. In its day, the mine reached back into the hill in its coal vein quite a long way. I remember as a child going in there as far as I dared go, which was maybe 100 yards, and I was still not to the end of anything. But the mine had iron rails on which the little coal cars would travel, pulled by a donkey. The men would go into the mine and they would drill holes in the coal vein. They would put in little charges of dynamite, break up the coal. Then they would bring the cart down, fill the cart by hand, pull the coal out onto a chute apparatus, and dump it for future sale. In the book that I mentioned, I have a picture of the old chute apparatus. It is not necessarily there at the present time. So coal then became the preferred heating for the valley, and this mine therefore became an important mine and continued through certainly the early lifetime of my mother's brother, Lloyd Henry. I think when the methane fields were discovered near Jensen, and for a period of 15 years the methane was harvested and sent by pipe to Vernal, the coal mines of this quality sort of went into an eclipse. But for its time and for the economic wherewithal of my maternal family, it was an important source of income and comfort, and so therefore forms part of my historical memory, because as a child I went down in the coal mine and picked up coal and carried it home. We're down in the bottomlands of Brush Creek now, and we're on the southern sweep of my dad's ranch. We're actually down on a 40-acre piece that was owned by the Kurtz family. Glenn Kurtz owns the property now. He's a little older than I, but in the early days my dad was leasing this 40 acres. He actually tried to buy it from the Kurtz family, but they wouldn't sell. He was leasing these 40 acres, and as a child I came down to here to work with him and was fascinated by the petroglyphs that you might see in the background on these sandstone cliffs. And the two petroglyphs that were most interesting to me were the trapezoidal representations of a humanoid man and woman. I understand from later reflection that it's probably done by the Fremonts, which means that they lived here and enjoyed these lands long before European settlers came. The kind of what we call the dugway that comes down into this valley from the bench area, which is off to my left, is a road that we transited from time to time to come down in here. About halfway down that dugway, my dad and I were riding our horses, and we came upon a cache that had been exhumed. A big stone had been moved from the cache. The cache was very carefully done with the stonework. There was it was probably as large as a refrigerator box, and we kind of wondered if Mrs. Kurtz or someone else had not used that to deposit checks from the government from her husband's service in World War I or something. Anyway, there were a few items left in that cache. One was a pair of French field glasses, a bit damaged but still operational, and happily those glasses now reside in the possession of my son Michael. So if you're interested in seeing what was in that cache, at least at that point, that's what I retrieved. And I've often wondered over the years, why would you build a cache like that, and what would you put in it? Obviously a pair of French field glasses, but what else? What else? Well, we were finally on the old Brush Creek Ranch that my parents owned from 1940 to 1945 or so, maybe 46. We talked about the provenance of this earlier on and how they obtained it, but I'm flashing through my mind right now lots of memories of this old cottonwood grove and a swing that my dad built for me, and really from a child's perspective, however tough it was for the older people, from a child's perspective, it was just a wonderful place. We're standing in front now of a cabin that was owned by Rebecca Bowen's father. I'm sorry I don't remember his name, but Rebecca Bowen was named Becky. That was her short name. And here, living in this cabin with her, was a guy named Ben Morris, who had just come in from the Dinosaur National Monument area, having been run off there by his wife Josie Morris. And he and Becky were living here. Now, Ben Morris was a tough guy, and as I mentioned to you earlier, he always carried a Colt 45 on his side, and I had the misfortune of asking him one time what the notches meant on his gun, and he told me, and we've already recorded that. but this cabin had a dirt floor, a sod roof, and in it was a bed and a little cooking place, a stove, and things of that sort that you'd have in by today's standards, a fairly primitive situation. Well, Ben Morris and Becky were not about to leave this property when my parents bought it, and they figured that it was a dastardly deed done by a mortgage company in Denver, Colorado, that had stripped them of their inheritance, and they were just about not going to leave. So I asked my dad one time when I was interviewing him, I said, Dad, how come Ben didn't kill you? And he said, well, I thought about that from time to time, but it didn't dissuade him. And so out in the background here off on the right was a stackyard, and Ben would habitually turn his horse into my father's stackyard, and there was, that kind of conflict going on. But I asked my dad, well, why did Ben leave? And Dad said, well, I loved him off from the property. And this is part of that story. But Dad was always kind and considerate to Ben and to Becky, and actually helped them out in several ways. And one morning, very early, when my dad was living in one of these cabins, there were 3 of these down here, and in one of them, Dad had a couple of hard hands living, Frank and Sam Sessions, and in the middle one was one that he had converted to a granary, and in which he had a camp cot. Becky came down just frantic, saying that Ben was really sick and in trouble, and could he please come and help him. And so my dad came and could see that the situation was really indeed of an emergency nature. It was probably a serious case of appendicitis or something like that. And even in 1941, 42, before penicillin becomes available, and the only antibacterial substance available is sulfa, this could be a life-threatening sort of situation. So my dad loaded him and Becky up in his 1934 Chevrolet stake rack half-ton pickup and takes him to the infirmary in Vernal. There was no hospital, anything of the sort. There was an infirmary. And there was a physician there with the name of Hansen who worked in that infirmary. And apparently what he had discovered is that Ben had a ruptured appendix, and it was indeed very serious. But my dad stayed there with him at the infirmary for 4 days until Ben was out of the I'm going to die, any minute mode. And from that time on, Ben Morris was indeed my dad's friend. And as soon as Ben got well, then he and Becky voluntarily left the property. So that's the story of this cabin and my dad's encounter with a very, very tough hombre by the name of Ben Morse, who, however, was not quite tough enough to stand up to his wife Josie, who ran him off with her 1894 Winchester .30-30 rifle. That's the story of this cabin.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that.
Maybe the background.
All right, you see the walnut trees in the background. Well, they are right now about the size they were when I was here as a child. The problem for a child was that one day some people from Vernal came in and cut them all down and carted them off. And it was Newton Saddlery who did that. And my dad had made arrangements to trade the walnut trees to Newton Saddlery for a saddle. My dad didn't own a saddle. He rode bareback. And with that saddle, which, by the way, is now owned by my son Jason in Arkansas, was the exchange. Now we come back and we see these trees have regrown from their stumps about the size they were 75 years ago. And Mr. Tenney has just told me that black walnut, that these are, if blocked out for the length of a gun stock and cured, are worth on the good market how many dollars?
$2,000.
$2,000 on the good market, which makes me want to come now, cut down these walnut trees and start over again.
Well, I'll take 50%.
You cut them down.
Okay. Now I mentioned to you that over here, about 100 yards, less than 100 yards, used to be a significant corral, a sheep corral, and there were lambing sheds and everything in that. And I remember one year my dad set up when the itinerant thresher would comb this valley and would come here. He would set the thresher up there and blow the chaff on top of the lambing shed for insulation purposes. In that area, Becky Bowen's father kept horses that the Butch Cassidy gang plied. And as I was mentioning to my children not too long ago, they could come through in the middle of the night and exchange horses and leave a couple of gold coins in the manger, and on their way back and forth from Wyoming, down to the Badlands in the south. And I always thought to myself, wow, I walked the same ground that Butch Cassidy did. Anyway, that's part of the lore of this place, and thank you very much for allowing us to come and talk about it.
No problem.
We're still at the Brush Creek Ranch and overlooking behind me at the actual Brush Creek that runs through this old ranch. My dad had 230 acres of bottom ground here and hillside up behind us a little. He also had a grazing allotment over on the far side to the east, far side behind me. And it was always a constant struggle to deal with coyotes, particularly during the lambing season. Coyotes would come in and they would just have a lot of fun killing lambs, not to eat them, but just to have fun to kill them. And where you see behind me that causeway, roadway over a culvert, there was a walking bridge, and that was the only access from where we are standing now to the far side of this property that has about 15 acres in it. My dad put in a culvert across the creek to get water to that 15 acres in order to graze it. But also it was a place during the springtime, during the lambing season, where they would cut down cottonwood trees and fire them up at night to keep the coyotes at bay. So you would hear the coyotes howling and howling, but they were afraid of the fire, and the sheep would come and be all around the fire. My dad had about 300 head of sheep, and that was basically what this ranch was about, was 300 head of sheep and what you could sell your lambs for in the fall. Well, across that footbridge, then the sheep would have to be taken from night to morning in order to get them around the fire, in order to protect them from the coyotes. And so every time the sheep were gathered in, they would cross that footbridge, and my dad would stand there and he would be counting his sheep. He'd always count in twos as they would cross the bridge to make sure that he hadn't lost a whole lot of sheep.
Were there rustlers?
The coyotes were the rustlers. On the far side of this mountain, his allotment went up there to some extent. And let's see, there's some flats up there, and what were they called? I've forgotten the name of that. But there was an escarpment up there with large boulders and whatnot. And one time I was up there with him, and he pried off a rock that went rolling down the hill and bouncing and jumping and would cascade in the air for maybe 100 feet and then come crashing down again. I thought that was so awesome. I said, we got to go back and roll boulders. We got to go back and roll boulders. But he never would again. I guess he had some sense of propriety about saving the planet or whatever. But that sort of sticks in my mind as well. But the whole issue of livelihood and maintenance of your investment as you struggled with a natural predator to survive was created a lot of ingenuity and a lot of work. I still remember the fires burning at night and how wonderful they were.